Context is everything. So when we say context, what do we mean? What are we talking about? We're talking about the geographic places that we grew up. We're talking about the time period in which we were raised, and we're talking about the environments that we spend our time in developing. And so when we think about this idea of context, people are constantly responding, adapting to, and interacting with their context. And so the context demands a certain type of behavior. I would not take my iPad on a canoe trip, right? Or whitewater rafting in Colorado. Why? Because that would be inappropriate for that context. And so context determines a great deal of how we're supposed to interact and how we deal with that. One of the things we also recognize about context is that it's constantly changing. How we're supposed to interact with the world, fashions, technology is constantly changing. And so if we lose the ability or the desire to adapt to the context as it changes, then we succumb to what happened to the dinosaurs, right? We, in fact, metaphorically become dinosaurs ourselves. And so we recognize that dinosaurs are no longer around because they could not adapt to the change in the environment. And whether that environment was changed by a meteor striking the Earth, or there were some other, um, you know, seismic shifts in the atmosphere, whatever was precipitated that, they could not adapt to that change. And so that gives us a great metaphor for thinking about the fact that we must change with our context and recognize the power of a context. So this leads us to this activity. What did I learn? What did you learn growing up? And this is a question more about looking at our context than it is about anything else, right? So this particular activity is not supposed to engender or lead us to shame, blame, fault, or guilt, but to really have us explore what it was that our context gave us as our paradigm, as our worldview. And so when you think about this, the time frames associated with growing up, however you define that is up to you. But I am curious as to what you learned. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to share what you learned growing up, but I want you to do it in a particular kind of way. What I'd like for you to do is if you learn something positive, I'd like for you to put a plus in the corresponding box. If you learn something negative, I want you to put that negative in a corresponding box. And if there was never any conversation by any of the groups that are identified on this sheet, I want you to put a zero, right? So you can have pluses, minuses, and zeros. You can have pluses and minuses in the same area, but the size of your plus, the size of your minus will dictate how much you learned, right? So let's get to the activity. So here you will see that there are categories across the top. And I will tell you that we did not put all the categories that we could have across this top. And these are social categories given to folks, particularly in Western countries, right? So African Americans, European Americans, Latina Americans, Asian Americans, disabled Americans, and Native Americans. And what I'd like for you to do is to tell me what you learned about those groups from these groups on the left. So from parents and family, what did you learn about these social groups? From friends, what did you learn about these groups from your friends? From school and workplace, what were the lessons taught about each of these groups? So forth and so on. TV, movie, and media, and your personal experience, right? And so as you go through this chart, putting your pluses, your minuses, and your zeros, I want you to think about um, how those lessons may have affected you. So first, let's start with pluses, minuses, and zeros. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. So now that you've come up with your pluses, your minuses, and your zeros, I'd like for you to break into either small groups, either in one of the chat rooms or sitting at your table, breaking into to smaller groups. Excuse me. So I'd like for you to break into smaller groups either at your table, you can go to the chat rooms, or you can just kind of sit with your thoughts. And what I'd like for you to do in those smaller groups is discuss your pluses, your minuses, and your zeros. And we'll give roughly about 5 minutes for that. All right. So go to your groups, go to your chat rooms, and or sit with your neighbors as you do this online. 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. All right. So I'm really curious as to where you had pluses, minuses, and zeros, but that's actually none of my business. So I don't need to know where you have pluses, minuses, and zeros. But I am curious as to part of your conversation around what those pluses, minuses, and zeros look like for you, right? And in what ways are they helpful or hindrances given where you currently are today? Um, I wonder how many of us had to overcome great obstacles to be the diverse and inclusive individuals we are today, and how many of us are still wrestling with some of those things that we were taught in our past. And so when we think about these things, this is not to, again, this is not about fault, blame, shame, or guilt. My parents did the best they could with what they had to raise me, and it would have never been enough for the challenges that I had to face. Right. So, for example, I have to, deal with or deal with my children and talk with my children about how to have appropriate relationships on the computer, right, with technology. And so my parents could have never taught me about sexting. They just couldn't have given that to me. And why could my parents have not taught me about the etiquette of having personal relationships using your phone device? Well, it didn't exist then, right? However, what they did give me is principles about how I should hold myself in the world, how and ask me to decide for myself, how do I want to present myself given the foundations that they presented. And so when we think about this chart, it's not about blame or shame or fault or guilt, but it is about asking, what was I taught that either no longer works for me, or do I need to augment given the fact that I'm in a different paradigm and a different context than those people who raised me? Also recognize that TV, movies, and media, their job is to sell advertising. And we know that advertising typically is the shock value kind of stuff. And it is very rare that either a television program or news story or our favorite opinion host on cable TV can actually give us a well rounded perspective or actually challenge us to think in new and different ways in the 22 minutes that they're allotted between commercials, right? So recognize that about TV, movies, and media, that we're not necessarily getting the truth, we're getting the advertisers' version of what the truth might be. So, and that goes for whatever media you use, that they are typically funded um, by advertisers. So we'll leave that. And I hope that you found that in your personal experience that you had actually more positives than you had negatives, but at the minimum that you found that there was a balance between both positive and negatives with each of these groups. Now, we could add more groups, and you can think about what groups you might add, and you may even want to talk about those groups either in the chat room, in your notes, at your table, but recognize that the principle that is being presented here, which is that there are gaps in what we know about other people, and it may in fact impact how we interact with them. And so these pluses, minuses, and zeros. And so, what purpose do some of these pluses, these minuses, and zeros serve? When do they no longer serve us? And what do we do when we find that there's a need to change? Right. So, so there is that, and that is the what did you learn activity.